Welcome to Upstart Crow, a part of Watershed Lit Radio. Join us as we explore books and culture through engaging conversations with writers, historians, and creatives, offering unique insights into the literary arts and beyond. Hosted by Ken Budd, Jennifer DeSano, and William Miller. Now, here's the show.
Hello, welcome to Upstart Crow. I'm William Miller. My guest today is Cristina Jimenez, author of the memoir Dreaming of Home, which was one of the 3 finalists for the New American Voices Award, sponsored by the Institute for Immigration Research and presented at the Fall for the Book Festival. Welcome, Cristina.
Great to be here.
This book traces your experience after moving with your family to the United States when you were a high school student. It follows you through getting your diploma, going through college, becoming an activist, developing what turns out to be a really strong voice for social justice.
Yes, this is a story of a coming of age, which is, my coming of age as a young undocumented woman and finding my voice and my power, even though I was undocumented, but finding that, meeting other student activists and organizers. But it's also the story of the coming of age of the immigrant youth movement and how undocumented young people have made history through their organizing and their courage to share their stories.
You co-founded and for a time served as the executive director of the organization United We Dream, which is one of the largest immigrant youth-led organizations in the country. I think I saw something, you guys are up to hundreds of thousands of members and affiliates now. And you've been credited with steering national and state campaigns for immigrant justice, as well as helping with the passage of DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. And you've been appropriately recognized. A MacArthur Genius Fellowship, the Freedom from Fear Medal from the Franklin Institute, named to Time's list of the 100 best and most influential people. And you've become a distinguished lecturer at City University of New York. That's quite a list.
It's, recognition, I think, mostly of the bravery and the work of people like my own parents who leave everything behind and flee terrible conditions in different parts of the country to come and seek a better life here in the United States. And I take these recognitions truly as a way of a recognition to all immigrants and refugees who are forced to find belonging in a new place, and they get to find community and build lives.
Let's start with the title, Dreaming of Home. In the epilogue, you define home in a kind of interesting way. You basically define home as the place where you can look in the mirror and like what you see.
Yes, as an immigrant who with my family, I had to flee home. I lost a sense of home early on as a young person when we had to leave Ecuador and flee poverty and the political violence and the conditions there. And getting to the United States, being a new place, I felt I didn't belong. New culture, new language, everything was new. I felt so afraid. And over time, I realized that I found home in people that made me feel that I belong, like my friends and my teachers in my high school in Queens, where we spoke over 70 languages, and there were people from all parts of the world. And also finding home in college and in a community of student activists and organizers that became the immigrant youth movement. And, particularly because I have experienced feeling this is home for me. And at the same time, I am not wanted by the place that I consider home. When you hear things like our current government is saying about people like me, and when you see ICE agents terrorizing communities, separating children from their families, going after people who look like me, it's very hard to feel like you're loved or that you belong in the place that you consider home. So I always think of this as this very, complex and contradicting experience of this place being home and me feeling home in community and in people and also feeling rejected and not wanted by the place that I consider home. So that experience has really illuminated for me that home is also within yourself and finding belonging, safety, and self-love also within, while also recognizing how important it is to feel at home and feel safe and that you belong in a community of people that make you feel that way.
That is a complexity and if you will, a kind of paradox. On the other hand, you kind of came to the U.S. out of a paradox. Let's talk about that for a few moments. Ecuador, when you were younger, before you left there, it had gone through a period where the U.S. came down and said, basically, open up your systems, open it up, and have free market. Let the Western culture come in, and let the companies come in. Let us sell to you. Let us export your oil. Let us buy from you. And I think there were promises made that this was going to be good for the people, but it didn't work out that way.
I think we're seeing, what happened in Ecuador and my experience coming from a poor working class family there, is in many ways what you see corporations doing here in the US and across the world, where there's this idea that it's sold to people, that corporations will bring prosperity, that it will lift everybody up, that people will have jobs. And in the case of Ecuador, U.S. corporations worked in partnership with the government at the time to take ownership of the oil region and exploit their region, not only of the natural resources, but also, in terms of damage to communities, indigenous communities, contamination, and the profits mostly went to the corporations and not to the people. And so even though there were corporations like Texaco that was getting, richer and richer and richer from oil profits, the country was falling into deep poverty. And that is part of the conditions that led my family to flee from the situation. So to your point around the complexity, it's how there's forces that are much more powerful, corporations, entities that are so much more powerful than many of us working class people or poor people, and their decisions and the decisions of governments ultimately have devastating impact on people's lives. And in my case, and in the case of millions of people across the world, they create the conditions for many of us to have to flee our homes and find homes somewhere else.
There was a presidential election in Ecuador. Bucaram won, and he had run what I think we would call a populist campaign, where he was promising to kind of reverse the effects of the free market system that had been imposed, and he was going to redistribute the wealth, so to speak. But what happened, of course, is that he won, and it seemed like the money just went even faster to the tycoons and the rich people and the corporations, and the citizenry rebelled.
Yes. So what I remember, and again, I think that the was remarkable in the process of writing this story was, as a child, you don't understand all of the political factors that may be taking place, but you're a witness. And I remember witnessing national strikes where indigenous people, working class people, the labor unions, the teachers, the students were taking over the streets of Ecuador. The military was deployed. For weeks and on, the country was on strike because working class people were pushing back against policies like the privatization of water, of electricity, and both the president and his family getting richer from some of the companies that they owned, and other corporations and wealthy people that were using that as an opportunity to get access to resources. And what that created was like a contradiction around what this president, promised of being like the president for the poor people. And when he came, changing all of these policies in a way that benefited the elites and the wealthy and really, really hurt working class people. So you see this a strong movement of people that ends up forcing the removal of the president. And then the country enters into a contentious conflict about who the next president will be. The country ends up having like 3 or 4 presidents in a week. I tell the story in the book, but to me, what was remarkable writing this story as an adult is understanding the power of organized people and the power of movement in holding those in power accountable and pushing back against policies that were impacting their lives.
And how old were you when this was going on around you?
I was 11.
And yet you were aware of it. I mean, this is tumultuous stuff to be witnessing when you were 11.
It's quite scary because what happens, well, when the country is in a national strike is that the schools are shut down, you're in a curfew, you can't leave your home, and you're watching all of this mainly through, what you watch on the news, on TV. So as a child, you see all of this, and I remember seeing the panic in my parents' eyes, but I would ask them, would everything be okay? There were images of places in the street that were, cars on fire and other things and things turning violent. And I remember my parents always saying like, we will be okay. Don't worry. But I can see the anxiety and the panic in their eyes. And so fleeing, remembering to flee that situation, it brought both the relief, but the fear of what was about to come as well.
Your mother, when she was a young woman, had wanted to she wanted to go to college and become a history teacher, but she wasn't able to do that. She ended up, I guess, going to hairdressing school first, but also she learned to sew.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And in this time period when things are so tumultuous, she wasn't working in either of those per se, but she was trying to make do by sewing things, linen, napkins, and tablecloths, and trying to sell those.
I think of both of my parents as, working class folks that were just trying their best in very terrible conditions. And my mother, like when I think about the role that she's had in my life, she's so courageous and like she never gave up. And she shares with me this dream when I'm helping her while she's sewing a dress for a client, and I'm helping her in that moment to find some tools and buttons that she was looking for. And I love being her assistant when she was set up in the living room of our home to sew. And I remember finding this book that looked like a fancy Bible, or, the ones that like the priest will show in the cathedral with like the golden edges. And I started skimming through it, and I see these drawings of couture dresses. And I asked her, whose sketchbook is this? And she said, oh, that was like what I did to graduate from as a seamstress in my school. And I said, like, oh, Mom, you could make really fancy dresses for people like celebrities that we see on TV. And she laughed and she said, I don't like sewing, and you don't want to end up like me. So you have to like really study hard, fight for your dreams. And this is why I'm working hard so that you have more options. And I remember that conversation. And what I am so grateful for at that moment is understanding why my mom was so strict with me about my studies and my assignments and my homework. And that courageousness and that rigor of my mother is also really what gets me through in the U.S. Every time I felt that I couldn't learn the language, or every time I felt afraid of even going to get my vaccinations to start school, or when I was told by a college advisor that I couldn't go to college because I was undocumented, it was my mother who said, like, we cannot give up and we're gonna find a way out of no way. And that it's, part of her own testimony, I think, of her own life that she passed on to me.
Unlike some families that are living below the poverty line, your dad was there, though, and he was contributing. He was working, but he lost his job and was working at something that paid like half or less than what he'd been earning before.
Yes, both of my parents, were struggling in Ecuador, and my dad had a job as part of the security team of a bank, and the bank was shut down, and him and thousands of people lost jobs. And he will try to find work, and he just wouldn't find it until he found something driving a transporting roses from different parts of the country into the city, and that paid less than half. And so it is in that situation where, like, my mother can't uh work, can't find a way to sustain our family through sewing or through doing haircuts. um and she starts selling things for restaurants in the neighborhood, like table clothing and napkins. And my dad is now working as a truck driver. But we are now at that point in a situation where, even though they're working, we're having to make choices about food portions, and not just having enough food to, not enough food to eat, and or enough money to pay for food, and or to pay for rent, and or to pay for my education and my sister's education, the two of us who were going to school at that time. And it is in that moment where they find themselves having to make those hard choices, and that if they would choose to feed us, they would not be able to pay for our education. That really brought, especially to both of my parents, who truly believed that education was the best thing that they could do for their kids so that we could have a better life. That was very heartbreaking for them, and they tried all the ways, but when they couldn't, it's when leaving the country became the only option.
There was an embarrassing moment, though, at school, wasn't there?
Such a hard moment. I was a young, my gosh, I was a child going to school. I was going to this all-girl Catholic school, and the nun from the financial office came into the classroom, and she starts calling on the names of students, including mine. We are asked to stand up, and then we're told in front of everybody that if we don't pay for our tuition, we will not be allowed back. Up until that point, I realized that my parents have been struggling to pay for our tuition, and what a painful moment to experience the shame of not having the money to pay for tuition, and then being told in front of everybody we will not be allowed back unless we pay for our tuition. That is when I realized how difficult and how serious the situation with my family was. But I think for me, it was also a very painful moment that um the nuns, who we think as of holders of Christian values and of being in support of the poor, will put many of us as children in that situation, and will shame us for not having the money to pay for school.
What is the schooling situation? You were in a Catholic school. Were there public schools you could have gone to?
So my parents, in Ecuador, the public education system it's
At that time, anyway.
at the time anyway, was just like not good. And a lot of kids actually do not even have access to public schools over there. And when you do, there's often a shortage of classrooms, shortage of desks or chairs, a shortage of teachers at that time. And so my parents, again, because they believe that an education will bring about a better life for their family, and they had dreams of going to school. You know, my dad had a dream of becoming a lawyer. My mom had a dream of becoming a teacher. Because they also came from working class and poor family backgrounds, they also couldn't go to school or finish school. And both of them started working early on to support their families. So their dream was that they wanted to make sure that if they didn't have that, I could have access to that their children could have access to an education. And that's why they work hard to, pay for a Catholic school education, um, that could guarantee that you will have a teacher, that you will have a desk, that you will have a classroom. But when they really experienced the fact and faced the fact that they could not longer pay for what they considered to be a good education for their kids, and they also couldn't feed us, it that became a really difficult situation to face.
Now, your dad had come over to the U.S. Once before on a tourist visa. I guess he was just out of high school, a young guy wanting to see a bit of the world. And so he came to New York and kind of fell in love with a bit of it.
Yes, my dad, it was in the 80s, and he had friends that lived in Brooklyn. And they had said to him, you should come visit. My dad was actually a professional wrestler. He was an athlete, and he had traveled to different parts of Latin America representing our country in the sport. Through that, he had made many friends, and he had friends in Brooklyn. And he had an opportunity to go. He was able to get a tourist visa and travel and visit his friends. And when he arrived to New York City, I was a child when he would tell me the story of seeing people from all over the world in many languages, and hearing music, and particularly African music that he didn't understand in Brooklyn, and meeting immigrants from all over the world and hearing very heartbreaking stories for how people have fled different parts of the world, and him just feeling like, wow, this is what people go through, and how painful. And I wouldn't want my family to ever go through that, but I would love for my kids and my family one day. He was still a single man at the time, but he dreamed of bringing his family to get to experience vibrant New York City and look at the Statue of Liberty. And, he tells the story that he went to a store where they were like selling jeans by the pound, and he bought jeans for all the family members. And the diversity, the trains, the skyscrapers, and all of these very affordable, cool American clothing, were things that he wanted his kids to also get to experience one day, visiting New York City. We never thought, right? Like, he probably never thought that he would end up having the painful experience of having to migrate to the United States. But, by the fall, then his kids and his family having the experience of living in New York City.
But that means you're coming to a country that had a hand in the turmoil that you're running away from. I mean, how satisfying is it to say, well, we're going to America, when you know that it was America that intervened and kind of created some of the issues in your homeland?
Well, as a child, I did not know that, right? And so it is as an adult, and I don't really think my parents really understood all of the connections either. And so for us, the situation just got really bad. We couldn't afford food, we couldn't afford rent, we couldn't afford school. So we had to flee and seek a better life in a different country. And it is through me being able to go to college, get an education, also get involved in community organizing, where I'm getting trained as an organizer, and I'm meeting people who have learned about the history of this country, of immigration, of different movements, and of organizations like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so it is in this process of finding my voice and building consciousness, and gaining knowledge and information that I didn't have access to before, that as an adult, as a young adult, I'm getting to make the connections that, wait a minute, the United States plays a role in creating conditions in other parts of the world that force people to flee. And then we are here, and then we're not wanted, and then we are exploited, and we're deported, and we are the ones accused of having committed a crime. And so, particularly, I named this part in the book where Vice President Kamala Harris, under the Biden administration, travels to Guatemala, and she's hosting a press conference. And she is, right, like the first woman in that role who comes from both a Black and an immigrant background. And she stands up in that press conference and starts saying the message to people who are fleeing to not go to the United States, to not come, she says, and she repeats it various times. And I remember hearing that and following the news of what she said and thinking that how disconnected that statement is from really grappling with the truth of why people leave or why people have to leave, and the role that the U.S., particularly in the Americas, in the continent, the role that the United States plays in creating those conditions. And then saying don't come as if people have, as this is an option, as if people want to leave their places. And, through the stories that I share in the book, it's clear that for most people, leaving their homes and leaving everything they know and leaving their family members and not knowing when they will see them is the last resort, is the last resource for safety and for love. But I do think that for me, realizing that as a young adult, it's such an important perspective and a learning that I hope readers get to have, and that engage and that will help us engage in more real ways with, what are the policies that the U.S. has domestically, but also internationally, and how the country and our governments bear their responsibility for creating conditions that destabilize people's lives around the world. And so that then, therefore, what is our responsibility to repair and to address the harm that has been done?
Yeah, good luck with that. That our politicians and leaders will, from one administration to another would even, be consistent. I mean, particularly after a couple of decades or so. But one of the other points that you make in the book is how much the U.S. relies on foreign workers, and this has to include undocumented workers, and how willing the industries and work, the employment sectors are in terms of making use of these. Something like half of farm workers are undocumented workers. 15%, these are your numbers from the book, 15% of construction workers, 9% of food service workers. And most of these workers are used because they aren't getting paid minimum wage.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a causal connection here.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think your dad had, once he got to New York, had an experience where he got a job and he was working and he kept working, but he realized they weren't paying him. And so the attitude is sort of like, yeah, we quit paying you. We don't want you anymore. We don't need you anymore. We got somebody who'll do it for even less. Go find something else. And if the person protests, well, okay, but you owe me money. Their attitude is sort of like, okay, what are you going to do? Call a cop?
And some of the employers threaten the workers directly that they will call ICE, that they will get them deported, and that it could lead any way of you demanding for your righteous, pay for your work could lead to deportation and the separation of your family. And this is what we see across the country in this moment. You see the deportations and the targeting of our neighbors and immigrant workers who are powering different industries and economies across the country and that are being the target of deportations. And the truth is, our immigration system has created this. Our current immigration system does not provide ways in which workers can come in, have work permits, and also have the ability for their rights and protections as workers to be honored and protected. What we have right now is a system that benefits from having people here who are undocumented. We have employers that can attract and that will continue to attract and, undocumented labor, undocumented workers. And corporations and these employers continue to benefit. But the truth is that having employers that can do that with a group of workers actually allows for the entire lowering of standards and worker protections for all workers. And so, when I think about right now across the country, the majority of people, working class people, are saying we are worried about the cost of living. We're worried about wages. And in similar ways, immigrants are experiencing the same. So immigrants and non-immigrant workers are facing the same challenges, are facing the same economic concerns and issues. And quite frankly, then you look at who is to blame, right? Like those in power making decisions and those corporations also benefiting from the labor of working class people or undocumented workers. So there's a lot more that we shared in terms of interest and fate in this country, in spite of all the division that we hear right now. But I do think that all of us as workers in this country and as consumers, we really have to face the hypocrisy of the system that we have right now, that it allows for people to have your produce, your chicken on the table, the construction of your homes, the delivery of your food, but it's persecuting these workers at the same time and targeting for deportation, and is exploiting their labor. So on one hand, we're saying we want the cheap labor, we all want to benefit from the cheap labor, and at the same time, we don't want you, and we're gonna turn you into a criminal.
Well, just the term illegal immigrant kind of imposes criminality right there, doesn't it? One kind of historical note, your book also makes the point, traces the history of this. The U.S. didn't establish visa requirements until 1924. I mean, we think about this as that was over 100 years ago, obviously, and this is a fairly new country in terms of the world. But nevertheless, that's not that long ago from a legal standpoint. Prior to that, you didn't even have to have a passport. You just showed up at one of the points of entry and said, "Hi, we're here." And they said, okay. If they didn't understand you, they gave you a name and they registered it and said, "Go have a nice life."
Yeah. So, part of like what I want to do with Dreaming of Home is that we can learn about this country's history that sometimes we are either lied to or we just don't get to learn. And for so much of the conversation today about borders and, who got here in the right way or not, the truth is that before 1924, our country technically had an open border policy where people mainly from Europe, they will get on ships and show up in a port of entry, whether that was at Ellis Island or somewhere else. People will be welcomed and people will be able to stay. In fact, our own government used to work to reunite families so that they can find each other. Because sometimes the parents will come first, the children will come later. But I think that the reason why I think that this is important is also because the racial dynamics and the vision of this country as a white nationalist country versus a multiracial democracy, it's not something that we're just debating today. This is something that comes from the founding of this country, and with the legacy of colonization, with the legacy of slavery, these are the same questions that have been at the center of the debate in this country: who belongs and who doesn't, and who gets to be a citizen, who doesn't. And when the group of migrants coming into the U.S. started to look like what at the time for the government was not the good immigrants, which, were people from Eastern Europe, as an example, and also people of color from other parts of the world. Then 1924, the READS Act gets established to make it so that only those who are considered to be the good immigrants, which was folks from Northern Europe, that only those people could come. So it's, when we see this moment where like ICE agents are targeting Black and brown people, they're also even going after white folks who are U.S. citizens because they're standing up to protect their neighbors. In the case of, what we saw in Minneapolis with Alex and Renee, who were killed by ICE agents. And these are two U.S. citizens in their community who came out to defend their neighbors from the targeting of ICE. When we see all of that, but we also recognize the history and where this history comes from and how racialized it's been, and the embedded, anti-Blackness and racism in our institutions, in our policies, in the culture, it's not hard to understand then why we ended up where we are now.
In your book, you also make note of several sort of famous people or their families. So the first sort of visa requirements are imposed in 24, and you cite Jared Kushner, who's Trump's son-in-law. His family in the 1930s illegally crossed borders and said they had a U.S. sponsor to enter the country, and apparently they didn't. Irving Berlin's family came over. He was the famous composer, of course, musical composer. There's a lawyer, Alan Gerson, you cite, that his family actually bought another person's family name in an underground that had sprung up at that time period. And they were fleeing Europe and all the things that were beginning to happen in Europe. And of course, right now, everybody's sort of saying, that we are under attack. The white people are under attack, and and there are many examples of that. And I don't know if you've heard this, but in the Nazi era, there was a guy, Hermann Goering, who was being tried in Nuremberg after World War II, and he was being talked to by a psychiatrist who was trying to evaluate him, and the psychiatrist was sort of probing, how did you get the German people to sign on for another war so quickly after all the devastation of World War I? And he said, it's actually quite simple. All you have to do is tell them they're under attack.
Mm-hmm.
They'll do anything. And he says, and if everybody doesn't sign on, you point out those people, you identify those people who haven't signed on, and you tell them they're being unpatriotic, and you'll get most of them to turn around.
Well, it is the playbook that we're seeing now. I mean, we are in a moment where we need to call it for what it is. These are not democratic conditions. And what happened in many ways in Germany as it relates to creating a sense of fear and who the enemy is and who's under attack and centralizing power. It's so much of what's happening right now where, saying that immigrants are a threat to people. I mean, we just heard it in the State of the Union. It was all about how immigrants are dangerous, how immigrants are a threat to this society, to this country. And if you say enough and you use the media and information systems to do that, like people will believe that. And so we're seeing the same tactics, like how immigrants and immigration are being used to destroy our democracy and to go after everyone. And at the same time, this can get a very bleak conversation, but to me, what I think about is like how hopeful I feel in spite of that, because what you see across the country, it's communities watching out for their neighbors. I was just in Georgia a couple of weeks back where like people were bringing groceries to families that were staying in place because of fear of ICE. We have seen in Minneapolis the bravery and the courage of people of what they've done, taking care of their neighbors and protecting them from ICE. And we see people protesting across the country what's happening. And in fact, all the polling is showing the majority of the country disagrees with how this administration is going after immigrants, and they feel like this is way, way too far from what people want to see. And so seeing people taking action, expressing their opposition is part of what makes me feel hopeful that we are not abiding by what we see, even though they're trying to create fear, even though they're trying to say that you and I, should fear each other. Even though they're saying that we should fear our neighbors, what you're seeing instead is actually a stronger movement to be neighborly and to show up for our neighbors and to really recognize how our futures and our lives are connected, but also that we have power to define the future of this country and who gets to be in it and who belongs. And so I think that what you're seeing in this moment, it's such an inspiring set of communities that are saying, this is not who we want to be. And we want to be different.
Let's go back, though, in your own personal story and in your growth, if you will. When you arrived here, you were 12 or 13? 13?
13.
13. You were not the well-spoken, articulate, strong person that you are now. You were in school, but describe yourself.
Yeah, and Dreaming of Home, as I said, is a coming of it's a coming of age story of a young woman that was very afraid and very ashamed of being an immigrant, of being a woman of color, of not speaking English, or even when I got to speak English, doing it with an accent, and who lived in fear that could be deported any minute, or that her family members could be deported any minute. And that fear, what it does to you is that it silences you. And everything around me, right? Like the media would also say, like, I wasn't wanted as an immigrant here. I was considered to be a criminal. And as a young person, you internalize that. And I internalized that so deeply that, like, to some extent, I believe my family had done something wrong for seeking a better life. You start believing these stories about yourself. And what that made me do was to be under the radar, don't bring attention to myself, never ask for anything more than what I was given, and to, like, not even believe that I had the right to go to college or the right to be in this country. And so, going from that to where I am now, it's a big jump.
But it didn't happen overnight.
It did not happen overnight.
You had aspirations. You wanted to go to college, but you weren't even sure if you could get in.
And I was told I couldn't either, right? Like, because I was undocumented, I was told by my college advisor that I couldn't go to college, and I thought it was over. So it took my mother and her courage and always pushing me to not give up. It also took teachers that saw in me things that maybe I didn't see myself, and who, even though many of them didn't know how to help me or students like me at the time, they never gave up, and they were trying to figure out ways to support me. So, my college advisor tells me, you cannot go to college. I cannot help you. Even though, I was an honor student. And then my ESL teacher, Miss B, tells me, I don't know how to support students like you, but I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to find out. And this is when she comes back and she helps me apply for the City University of New York. And, I tell the story in the book for how I end up going to college. But there are people, these characters, these people in the story, whether that was the students or the neighbor or the teachers, and my mother, who, like, helped me not lose the hope, but also who, like, tangibly really helped me to move through these very difficult moments. And as I go into college, and I start meeting other students like me, and I hear their stories, and then I meet Marie Gonzalez, and and she's sharing her story of being undocumented and facing deportation. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I could be Marie. My family could be Marie. And so seeing their acts of courage and meeting others, it's what gave me courage to share my story for the first time as a young person. And even then, there's this story in the book that I share, that even when I share my first time, my story, I was so afraid I used a fake name because I was so afraid that something could happen to my family and I. But I share it. I remember sharing that my name was Sandra, when in fact it was Cristina, but it was my first way of, getting to courageously share my story. And that led to me being involved in community organizing and in activism and fighting deportations in my community. And it is through that work, through realizing that we could stop somebody's deportation, that we could stop Marie's deportation, as an example, that gave me the courage to also find my voice and realize my own power, regardless of being someone that didn't have, papers. So what I say to people when I travel across the country to share this story with the book, I know that the times that we're in are hard. I know that we can feel very overwhelmed. But if young undocumented people like me had the courage to share our stories, to fight for our dreams, to fight against deportations, and we were able to win change, and have been able to, defend people from deportation, imagine the rest of us that may not be in such vulnerable situation. Imagine what we could do together if we take action.
You do cite several instances in the book of people being arrested and scheduled for deportation, and you guys in the network go to work and you kind of stop them from being deported. Do you think that's doable today the way it was back then? I mean, that was more than a minute ago.
Yes. Well, what we see is that organizing communities, it still works.
Yeah.
Like, it still works in the sense that, using your whistle to alert your community to not go out is saving people's lives. Bringing food to your neighbor is saving people's lives. We are seeing the many cases of students and of others, of parents and mothers, or even Liam, the 5-year-old child from Minneapolis that was taken to a detention facility in Texas. He was released. There are many, many stories of people that have been released from detention and reunited with their families because communities are organizing, because they're saying, no way, we are not going to accept this. And they start calling, they mobilize, they call their members of Congress, they work with lawyers. And, certainly I wouldn't say that it is to the same level that we could do it before. Also, because the magnitude of the attack and the targeting, it's so much bigger now than, the early 2000s or 2010, 2009, when I talk about these stories. So it's definitely, like, without a doubt, a much more challenging terrain. And even so, the organizing of communities, people coming together to say no and taking action about it, it is winning the release of people in many cases.
You also in the book do a really great job of getting us behind the political scenes. You talk a little bit about Obama and what he was and wasn't doing and what he was and wasn't willing to do, and his negotiations with the Republicans and the opposite party. And talk about that for a few moments.
What I share in the book is just like the power of people coming together to share their stories. So sharing our story is, one way in which you're trying to convey and move people in power to do the right thing. And I realize that although that's an important part of the work, it's insufficient and it's not enough. You also need to have the kind of power, the kind of political power, to force decision makers and policymakers to do something, even if they don't want to do it. And I tell the story of how we were able to win the DACA program that protected over 600,000 people from deportation in 2012. And this is not because originally the Obama administration agreed with us. He was really forced to do it through our organizing and advocacy and pressuring from different points. And, I particularly remember leaders from United We Dream meeting with members of Congress, meeting with the administration, with the Obama administration, and saying, we know that the president has the power to temporarily protect some people from deportation. And as ICE is continuing to target young people and families, which was true at the time, even under the Obama administration. And this is just, what it shows you how rogue ICE has been as an agency for a really long time. And the administration will say, like, we can't do it. So I tell the stories of how we were able to put together like legal experts that then said, yes, the president has the legal authority and power to be able to do this, and how our organizing and us following President Obama everywhere and reminding him that he could do it, how that led to the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program.
Sometimes chanting a parody of his own campaign slogan by chanting,
Yes, we
yes, you
can.
can. Yes, you
Yes,
can.
there was an event where he was speaking, and our leaders from United We Dream interrupted his speech by chanting when he said, like, I cannot do anything without Congress. And the whole room broke into a chant saying, yes, you can. Yes, you can. And that was just, one example of the many things that happen, not only, publicly, but also many conversations behind the scenes that led to the Deferred Action for Child Arrivals program.
Well, Obama may have understood that, he wasn't going to be president forever, and the Democrats probably weren't even going to hold the White House or Congress forever, and that he was probably, that if he did anything, it might get undone by some future administration, like, whatever. And he was putting a lot of his weight behind healthcare reform, and probably, I think he said somewhat seriously at the time that people may not have the appetite or the energy for something like immigration reform. But I do think also that the organization that you put in front of him made it sort of like, okay, we've got to do something and we've got to respond to this. It's a mass grassroots kind of growth here that we need to respond to.
Yes, again, this is like goes to the power of people organized across the country. United We Dream at the time with thousands of members. Now it's over 1 million members across the country, which, include undocumented young people and also young people who are children of immigrants who are U.S. citizens and are involved to advance the rights and justice for immigrant communities. And what we created through sharing our stories, through reaching out to our members of Congress, reaching out to elected officials at the local level, holding rallies and marches, and people walk from Miami to Washington, D.C., and from California, Northern California to Southern California. I mean, there were all these different ways in which young people were taking courageous action to create pressure, that we just ensure that there was no way that the White House could ignore us. And that was a demonstration of the power that we held. But also, to your question about the politics here, Obama wanted to be reelected. He knew that he was going to need the Latina vote. And he also knew that we, United We Dream and the immigrant youth movement had made our issue and our fight a litmus test for Democrats with the voters. And so it was also our organizing that made it an imperative that if they wanted to have Latina voter support, they knew they had to fight for this issue.
Well, and Obama also knew that every time the Republicans showed any willingness to negotiate on immigration policy, one of their key demands was more deportations.
Yes. And he always, even And I tell the story in the book. Like, he even said to me, like, we need to organize Republicans to, come to the negotiating table. And I think that the administration thought that if you did more deportations, you will be able to get Republicans to the negotiating table. And that was the false calculation. The Obama administration did more deportations at the time. They had a record number of deportations. He was even called the deporter in chief because of the record number of deportations. But Republicans never showed up. Republicans never showed up to the negotiating table. So the calculation was, if we do more deportations, maybe they'll negotiate with us on reforms. But that never happened. And there was no way that all of the organizing that we were doing, it wasn't moving Republicans. They really became an obstructionist party, and now has just become the party of Trump.
In a chapter in your book sort of traces the arc of your growth and of your growing knowledge. In a chapter titled "Wake Up," you say you've felt scammed as you learn some of the truths about America. How are you feeling these days? I mean, America is as complex as any other country in the world, right?
Sure. And I also think the idea of America that gets told to the world, including people that come here seeking a better life, is because it is known or is told to be the greatest democracy in the world. Where people from all backgrounds can come, and the land of opportunity, the land of justice, the land of freedom. That is what is known in the world about this country. And I think that those are the values and the ideas that draw many people here. And I believe in those. And with all my heart, I will want us to truly get there one day. So while all countries are complex, I do think that there is an exceptionalism about who we say we are to the world. And there's a very big gap between what we say we are to how we act and what we practice. And so, I will say that to me, when I talk about this experience of learning in college, that like people's vote don't count on presidential elections, that is actually through the electoral college. When you learn that in democracy, it's like one person, one vote, I felt very confused by that notion. I felt very confused that corporations could like buy elections. How could that happen in the greatest democracy in the world? So, I'm learning this in my democracy or political science 101 class in college. And we're reading this book called Democracy in Peril. And I'm learning about all of these different challenges. I think I said to myself, and when I said in this book, I felt scammed, is because I have been told a different idea what this country was. And then I was really finding out the real truth and of the challenges and the contradictions and the complexities. And for me now, I am more committed, fiercely committed for the values that drew my family here, that those values become true. And that's why I do the work that I do, to ensure that we could get to be the country of those aspirational values for everyone one day.
Very good. Thank you so much for taking the time for talking with us today about your experience and about your book. And I hope everybody who hears this, who hasn't read the book, will go get it, because it is very eye-opening and thought-provoking.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching Upstart Crow. If you enjoyed this episode, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and explore more conversations with writers, artists, and literary voices from our archive. You can also listen to Upstart Crow on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Visit upstartcrow.org for more information about our episodes, guests, our hosts, and ways you can support the podcast. Thank you again for joining us on Upstart Crow, a part of Watershed Lit Radio.